In the history of South Asia, there is one name that serves as a universal synonym for a traitor: Mir Jafar. It is a name whispered with the same venom one might reserve for Brutus or Judas. But this was no mere courtly intrigue. This was a betrayal that sold an entire subcontinent to a foreign corporation. One man's greed ended an empire and paved the way for 2 centuries of colonial extraction. But how did a trusted commander-in-chief become the architect of his own nation's downfall? To understand the magnitude of this crime, we must look behind the silk curtains of the Bengal court, where the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the stench of treason. When 23-year-old Siraj ud-Daulah ascended the throne of Bengal in 1756, he inherited more than just wealth. He inherited a nest of vipers. The young Nawab was impulsive, fiercely independent, and deeply suspicious of the British East India Company's growing influence. He saw them for what they were, not just traders, but a militarized entity eating away at Indian sovereignty. However, his attempts to curb their power earned him powerful enemies within his own palace. The wealthy banking family known as the Jagat Seths, and even his own kinsmen, viewed him as a threat to their established interests. Among these disgruntled elites was Mir Jafar, the commander of the Nawab's own forces. He was a man who felt overlooked and undervalued, possessing an ambition that far outstripped his loyalty. The atmosphere in Murshidabad was combustible, a powder keg of resentment just waiting for a spark. And that spark would come from a man across the ocean, a man who viewed India not as a land of culture, but as a ledger of potential profit. But could Siraj have known that his most trusted general was already looking for a buyer for his crown? Enter Robert Clive, a man described by contemporaries as unstable but undeniably brilliant in the dark arts of manipulation. Clive wasn't just representing a country, he was representing a corporation with its own private army. The British East India Company was desperate. They wanted duty-free trade and total control over the lucrative Bengal silk and saltpeter markets. Siraj ud-Daulah stood in their way. Clive realized that a direct military confrontation against the Nawab's massive army was a gamble he couldn't afford to lose. He needed an internal fracture. He needed a puppet. Through a network of spies and intermediaries, Clive began a secret correspondence with the disgruntled Mir Jafar. The offer was simple and devastatingly effective. The British would help Jafar overthrow Siraj, and in exchange Jafar would be installed as a puppet ruler under British protection. It was a deal signed in shadows, far from the eyes of the public. But what was the true price of this arrangement? As Clive began moving his troops toward a small mango grove called Plassey, the trap was already set. The British weren't just bringing cannons, they were bringing a contract for the soul of Bengal. The conspiracy to topple the Nawab involved a level of deception that would make a modern thriller seem tame. A wealthy merchant named Omishund acted as the middleman between the British and the conspirators. But Omishund was greedy. He demanded a massive percentage of the Nawab's treasury as a commission for his silence. To handle this, Robert Clive devised a scheme of breathtaking dishonesty. He prepared 2 versions of the treaty. The first, on white paper, was the real agreement with Mir Jafar. The second, on red paper, was a sham designed to trick Omishund into thinking he would be paid, a document that even included a forged signature of a British admiral who had refused to sign it. This was the foundation of British rule in India, a forged document and a double cross. Mir Jafar, meanwhile, was playing a dangerous game of his own. He swore on the Holy Quran to be loyal to the Nawab, even as his pocket held the British promise of the throne. The stage was set for a confrontation where the outcome was decided before a single shot was fired. But would Mir Jafar really have the nerve to stand by while his countrymen were slaughtered? The answer would come under a darkening sky at Plassey. June 23, 1757, a date that lives in infamy. The 2 armies met at Plassey, on the banks of the Bhagirathi River. On one side stood the Nawab's forces, 50,000 soldiers, heavy elephants, and powerful French-made cannons. On the other side, Clive had barely 3,000 men. On paper, It was a mismatch of epic proportions. But then, the skies opened. A sudden, violent monsoon downpour soaked the battlefield. The Nawab's troops, lacking proper tarpaulins, saw their gunpowder turn into useless paste. They assumed the British were in the same predicament. They were wrong. Clive, ever the meticulous strategist, had kept his powder dry under covers. When the Nawab's cavalry charged, expecting a weakened enemy, they were met with a devastating barrage of grapeshot. The Nawab's most loyal general, Mir Jafar, fell in the opening exchange. It was a moment of pure chaos and desperation for Siraj ud-Daulah. He turned to the one man who could still save the day, his commander-in-chief, Mir Jafar. But Jafar simply stood there, watching, waiting, and doing absolutely nothing. While the battle raged, a massive wing of the Nawab's army, commanded by Mir Jafar, remained frozen. Imagine the scene, thousands of soldiers standing like statues in the mud, refusing to move while their comrades were being torn apart by British artillery. Siraj ud-Daulah, realizing the walls were closing in, reportedly took off his turban and placed it at Mir Jafar's feet, begging him to defend Bengal. It was a plea for honor, for country, and for survival. Jafar gave him cold, empty assurances while secretly sending messengers to Clive, telling him that now was the time to strike. The Nawab's army, seeing their own commanders in action, fell into a panic. The retreat turned into a rout. Within hours, the largest army in India had dissolved into a terrified mass of fleeing men. Mir Jafar's silence was more powerful than any cannon blast. He hadn't just lost a battle, he had surrendered the keys to the kingdom. But what happens to a king who owes his crown to a foreign corporation? As the dust settled, the reality of Jafar's choice began to sink in. He wasn't a hero, he was an employee. The aftermath of Plassey was swift and brutal. Siraj ud-Daulah fled the battlefield on a camel, hoping to reach the French for reinforcements, but there is no sanctuary for a fallen king in a land ruled by spies. He was captured in Rajmahal, starving and exhausted, and brought back to Murshidabad as a prisoner. The end was not dignified. On the orders of Mir Jafar's son Miran, the young Nawab was executed in his prison cell. His body was paraded through the streets on the back of an elephant, a grim message to anyone who dared to defy the new order. Mir Jafar was finally placed on the throne, but the throne was now just a gilded chair in a British warehouse. Robert Clive walked into the royal treasury and was so overwhelmed by the mountain of gold and jewels that he later claimed he was astonished at his own moderation for not taking more. But while the British were celebrating, the people of Bengal were about to enter a long, dark night. The betrayal was complete, and the plunder was just beginning. The cost of the betrayal was astronomical. Mir Jafar was forced to pay the British East India Company over 22 million rupees, roughly £3 million at the time. To put that in perspective, that was more than the entire annual revenue of the British government. This wasn't just a payment, it was the start of what historians call the drain of wealth. Bengal, once the richest province in India and a global hub of textile manufacturing, was systematically bled dry. The company took over tax collection, leaving the local population with nothing. Within a decade, the region would be hit by a catastrophic famine that killed millions, while the company's profits continued to soar. Mir Jafar soon realized his mistake. He found himself constantly squeezed for more money by his British masters. When he couldn't pay, they simply replaced him with his son-in-law, only to bring him back later when it suited them. He lived out his final days as a broken man, a puppet whose strings were being pulled by men who didn't even speak his language. The betrayal didn't just kill a Nawab, it murdered the economic sovereignty of an entire nation. The gold from Bengal's treasury didn't stay in India. It flowed to London, fueling the Industrial Revolution. Today, Mir Jafar's palace in Murshidabad lies in ruins known locally as the Namak Haram Deori, the Traitor's Gate. His descendants still live in the shadow of his choice, often facing social stigma for a crime committed over 2.5 centuries ago. But the real legacy of Plassey isn't just a ruined palace. It is the map of the modern world. If Jafar had stayed loyal, if the rain hadn't ruined the Nawab's powder, or if the British had been repelled, the history of the world would look radically different. There might have been no British Empire as we know it, no Victorian era fueled by Indian resources, no partition of the subcontinent. It is a chilling reminder that the course of human history doesn't always turn on the will of the masses. Sometimes it turns on the greed of a single man in a quiet room, signing a paper he thinks will make him a king. Mir Jafar got his throne, but he lost his country, and the price of that seat was paid by generations of Indians who followed. The question remains, was he a villain of unique malice, or just a man who didn't realize the tiger he was invited into the house would eventually eat him too? History is often written by the victors, but the echoes of betrayal are harder to silence. If you found this dive into the dark corners of the past intriguing, make sure to like this video and subscribe to The Eerie Historian. We have many more stories of power, greed, and the secrets they tried to bury. Until next time, keep questioning the narratives you've been told.